Okay, let's make sure we're up and running here. I think so. All right, class. So it is Friday, September 11th, and obviously we're going remote through today, and at least today. We'll find out on Sunday whether we'll be in our Zoom room, owl room, in person, whatever they're calling all this, hybrid, flex, hobble gobble. I don't really know what terms they're using these days. It's a little bit goofy. So we'll hopefully be back together uh, vis-a-vis the owl classrooms, etc. on Monday, but we won't find out about that on until Sunday morning, I guess, or Sunday afternoon or something. I hope you're all staying safe with all the fire issues and the smoke. So it gives us a new appreciation for those who who purposefully, suck large volumes of smoke down into their lungs for the sake of fun. But man alive, this has been pretty crazy. So it is what it is. We've got to do the best we can and wrestle with the reality and move on. So that's what we're going to do. So a couple things, you guys should have been reading my emails. So this is a just quick reminder for you. I have gotten in all of my classes, it's not just you guys, I've gotten a lot of students that continue to be confused about what we're doing, which suggests to me, so they're not up with my instructions. So they're still coming to the Zoom rooms and they're still sending emails asking, so aren't we meeting today, and all the rest. So two things. First and foremost, make sure you check your Corbin email. This is how the Populi system allows the professors to reach out easily and send detailed messages to students about classwork and all the rest. Secondly, even if you do that and you're still not getting the messages, this probably means that you accidentally perhaps are having all of your or many of your emails from professors sent to junk mail somehow. So it's probably sitting in some junk mail folder. So you need to make sure you go through and adjust your settings accordingly so that you're getting all the messages and you know what's going on. So that's how we're communicating with you guys, certainly through this crisis, but that's how we would do it normally anyway, so that you're upfront, or we're upfront with you on our plans for the various courses. So please do that. Please check your emails pretty consistently as we move through the next few days, just so you're aware of what's going on. You'll see that I posted some information regarding assignments that are coming up. So we have a group that was going to be submitting their videos on Monday. Originally, that was planned. Their basically their bios, right? Their Greco-Roman bios, and everybody has their assigned figure. So the group that was going to go Monday, I've moved that back to later in the week just because of the scenario we're all working through. And I know some students have been displaced, or they're helping their families who are displaced because of the fires. So I just wanted to provide a few more days in this particular circumstance. So make sure that you're aware of that if you're part of Greek set number 1 that was due on Monday. Now it's pushed back to Friday, the 18th. So I think that's pretty much it for now. So today I want to start going through some elements of classical Greek culture, midway through our time, but I'm going to begin by finishing up with some stuff on the end of the Persian Wars, particularly what happens in 480 and 479 BC. So I finished up with, the first invasion in 490, resulting in the infamous Battle of Marathon. And then we talked about the second major invasion under Xerxes that occurs in 480 BC. And we, of course, did talk about the infamous battle in the passes of Thermopylae that occurred in August of 480. And the stand made by 7,000 Greeks, led by a spearhead of those 300 Spartans and their king Leonidas. So that's where we are, and I just needed to cut us off the other day, but I want to pick back up there and finish explaining how this plays out, because it has a dramatic bearing on the movement of Greek culture into what we now regard as the classical age. I'm sorry, my throat is really dry, even though I've been inside the smoke. You know, this is not a completely closed off environment, 100% anyway. So just even being around the smoke kind of gets to your throat after a while. So I'm doing the only thing a human being can do in these times, and that's drink a lot of coffee. So you'll have to be patient. Okay, so let me get my slide functioning here. My screen share is not working. Okay. Sorry guys, my slides are not functioning. The slideshow is not working for me here. I'm not sure why. All right. All right, guys, I don't know what was going on. I think we've got it figured out. So let's see if it's going to work for me here. There we are, back to a functional tech, apparently. Ah, what fun. I'm with John Scott on this one. There are times I just wish we were in classrooms and with whiteboards, although my drawing is not great, so drawing maps would not be fun for me. Never mind, forget I said that. That would not be fun. I know Professor Scott loves to draw on whiteboards. He's particularly good at it too. I don't mind writing some things on whiteboards, but I forgot how bad my art is. Okay, so the Battle of Salamis. This is a very important naval battle that occurs in 480. This is after the Greek defeat at Thermopylae. Remember that we're talking about a tactical defeat, and I mean, just in military terms, we're dealing with both a strategic and tactical defeat of epidemic proportions when we're talking about Thermopylae. But we will see that the long-term ramifications from that famous battle go a lot deeper than military strategies and tactics. So the Greeks succeeded at Thermopylae as far as holding off the advancement of that Persian force, which had lost more than 20,000 in the passes at Thermopylae in 3 days. The Greeks had lost less than 1,000 soldiers at Thermopylae, and they made the Persian forces pay dearly for their continued assaults on the pass. But ultimately, of course, we know that the Greek force falls. All 300 Spartans remained behind, allowing their Greek allies to move south and leave the pass, and then they made the ultimate sacrifice and died. This will ultimately serve as a rallying cry, an inspirational cry for many Greeks in the south, but for the moment, Greeks are just trying to lick their wounds and prepare for the next reality. Thankfully, there are some pretty cool-headed Greeks on hand during this moment in time, one of which is a famous Greek politician, an Athenian politician and general named Themistocles. So Themistocles had some military experience. He'd been at Marathon. He was one of the reasons the Greek force was able to defeat the Persians at Marathon. And he, from that moment on, from 490 on through the following decade, Themistocles had actually overseen a almost complete overhaul of the Athenian navy and had advocated throughout the Aegean with the members of the Delian League, the league we're going to be talking about in a bit today. So the members of this Athenian alliance, Themistocles had put forward plans to expand and to improve the Athenian navy along with those of the allies. This is critical for us to understand. Themistocles and his junior commanders have already been in a few different engagements with the Persian fleet. Themistocles realizes that this is another moment when they have to take advantage of what seems to be a very difficult situation, and yet he believes that there is a way to make this work for the Greeks, not against them. So as the Greek mainland, especially Attica, is being evacuated, and the elderly and women and children are being moved to a different location, south and east, Themistocles does something that is a major gamble. He makes the Persian king Xerxes believe that Themistocles is actually a traitor, and that he is upset with the Greek allies and is prepared, in fact, to pay homage to Xerxes the king and become one of his greatest servants. And so he sends him this message about the movement of the Greek forces, particularly the movement of the Greek naval forces, and tells Xerxes that if he's willing to accept this advice, and he comes into the Gulf of Corinth and tries to get there in force ahead of a massed Greek navy, that he'll be able to destroy that what remains, or what exists at that moment anyway, what exists of the Greek naval forces. And so he's trying to bait Xerxes. Now remember that Xerxes has already had a number of different Greeks who have turned against their own kind. Ephialtes is the one we talked about the other day, who sells out the Greeks at Thermopylae. And so Xerxes is becoming used to these Greeks who he thinks are just in fear for their lives, and have been overwhelmed by the sights of this massive Persian force. What this also indicates is that Xerxes is pretty confident in Persian success at this point, and does not believe that they're in any serious danger of losing this war. And so, although they're a little bit cautious, he does decide that there is an opportunity for the Persians, and he gathers the Persian force and brings them around the Saronic Gulf into this strait, and prepares to engage the Greek forces here. Now, a couple of things that we have to note. Since we can't travel to the port at Salamis ourselves, we can't see the landscape, there are a couple of important things to know. First of all, tidal patterns are important here, as they are in any part of the world, and knowing when those patterns exist and how deep or how shallow the waters tend to be during certain times of day. There are also wind patterns that become extremely important during the age of sail. So Themistocles knows these waters well. In fact, as a boy, he'd spent some time on land, not obviously living in the water. He's not a merman. He spent some time living in Salamis and knew this territory very well. And he's going to use the constriction of the strait. So it kind of has this bottleneck effect. The further you go into the strait, it's much more difficult to maneuver. And he's going to use some rocky outcroppings within the harbor, within the strait itself, to conceal a good portion of the Greek fleet, who are going to lie in wait, kind of connected to each other. They quite literally, they were linking boats with arms. They had Greeks pulling boats together with the sails down. They even had shrouds over the hulls as they were hiding behind these rocky outcroppings. And then they had this bait force, right, of Greek ships in the middle of the strait, and the Persians could see them very clearly. He also knows that the wind patterns so this is Themistocles I'm referring to again. He knows that the wind patterns tend to reverse course a little bit late in the afternoon. It's part of the tidal shifts and everything else that goes on. And he knows that they're going to begin to come from the northeast and move southwest, so that means, of course, that vessels who are able to utilize their sails with the wind coming from that direction will have better odds of success. So he knows all of these things, and it's critical for us to understand this, because the Persian force is actually quite large. The Greek force was probably at least 170, 150 to 175 ships, which is a big force, there's no doubt. The Persian force was much larger, may have been as many as 275 to 300 ships. I think that might be a bit of an exaggeration, but we are dealing with many thousands of seamen in these navies engaging in this fight. So here's how it plays out. The Persian fleet indeed comes in here, and as he did with as he did with Thermopylae, we're told that Xerxes was taken to this point on shore, about a half a mile or a mile away, where he was sitting on his golden throne overlooking the strait on the opposite side, which is fortunate for the Greeks because he could not see the ships behind those outcroppings. And he's sitting there on the cliff and watches this unfold, and obviously it's not going to go well for him. We'll see how this turns out here. So the fleets engage, the Persian forces sail into the strait. They get increasingly bogged down because there's no room to maneuver in that bottleneck. They still think that they have a major advantage because they are not seeing nearly as many Greek ships as they anticipated. But of course, it's all a huge trap. Once the Persian ships are in that bottleneck and they're all cramped up and they can't maneuver anymore, this is when Themistocles springs the trap. He brings the remainder of the Greek forces and converges, but he doesn't come all the way in. He forms a line initially and begins to assault with catapults and things on these triremes, and they're really hitting the Persian forces hard. The other Greeks, this is one of the more ingenious parts of the plan, the other Greek vessels that had been there the whole time that drew the Persian forces in, they had contingents, they had cohorts of Marines, Thessalian Marines, some Corinthian Marines. They had a number of Marines on board who were hidden. And then when this point, happens in the battle, they emerged and they began to jump aboard the Persian vessels and strike down all the Persian sailors who were not really trained with hand-to-hand combat quite as effectively. So all the way around, this is an ingenious plan. The Persian forces the losses here are catastrophic. There are various accounts of this, and they're all pretty straightforward in one sense. They're all very clear on the fact that the Persian naval force at Salamis is decimated to the point where they lost about at least 2/3, perhaps even 3/4 of their ships, and they lost equally as much with their manpower. Not just wounded, we're talking about dead. So the thousands and thousands of Persians aboard these vessels, the vast majority of them drowned. A few may have escaped and limped away, but this is an absolutely overwhelming defeat for the Persians. Now, the other part of this that's really crucial to understand is, remember when we talked about the linkage between the naval forces and the land forces? Well, if the Persian Navy is seriously decimated, as it was with Salamis, it means that the Persian land force is in deep jeopardy moving forward because it does not have the logistical supply network in place that it requires to succeed. So this becomes another critical reality. For the winter time, hold on just a second. So for the wintering months, the Persians actually moved back north and east, kind of licked their wounds and decided what to do. They actually lived out the winter on 3 or 4 separate islands northeast of Attica and prepared for the following campaign season. That campaign season brings us to the culminating battle of the Persian Wars, and it's the Battle of Plataea. So you have the Spartans and Tegians or Tegeans, if you're in the West, that's the term that's thrown around. It's actually, I think it's more accurate, the Tegians, but whatever, tomato, we won't bicker about that. The Athenians, they are all joined together here in this culminating battle. And what you must know is that although the Persian force still outnumbers the Greek force at Plataea, so at Plataea it's about 14,000 or so Greeks, 14 to 17,000 Greeks, and a Persian force that is still about 60,000, 65,000. So it's still a rather large Persian force by comparison. But what you also have to understand is that they were pretty. They'd been run roughshod. This is a pretty sad lot of Persians by the time we get to August of 479, a year after the Battle of Thermopylae. And the other thing here is the Persian commanders. There's been a lot of upheaval in the commanding ranks. The king Xerxes had decided to execute some of his senior commanders, both because they had not fared as well as he demanded in previous engagements, thought that the Persian force should have overwhelmed the Greeks a long time ago, but also because there were rumors of revolt, and revolt specifically against the king's power. So there had been some executions that had taken place. These Persians are, their force is actually, at this point, it includes a number of mercenaries that have been brought in. It also includes a fair contingent of slaves. This is not an overly cohesive fighting force. And as we've already said, many of their battle tactics and their weaponry are inferior when compared to the Greeks and the hoplite-phalanx system that the Greeks favor. In addition to this, of course, we have the Greeks defending their homeland. And anyone knows, if you are thinking about the importance of this. So let me find so you see in the map here, Athens, so north and west of Athens, you see where Plataea is located, and Thebes is not far away. You see the Delphi, you see what we're talking about here as far as these famous Greek locations. So the Greeks are defending their own territory. It's not far away that they have their families, their children, their wives, their parents. And so there's this added measure of inspiration and importance that's added to this. It's very weighty. And they realize that if something does go wrong at Plataea, then all of these people are in deep jeopardy, and everything that has been fought for is placed in deep jeopardy. So there's certainly that motivational factor that's in play. Added to this, of course, we know that the Greeks had overcome tremendous odds to this point in the Persian Wars. And even when it looked as if Greek civilization itself could conceivably be seriously damaged, perhaps even eliminated, perhaps even absorbed into the Persian Empire, that they have not allowed this to happen, that they've seized the moment and they have fought like lions to preserve what is theirs, the culture that they have created. And all of this is really important as we think about this engagement. And as it begins, the Greeks, almost predictably, you can see that the Greek commanders, their confidence is brimming. They are leading troops that are seasoned in battle, and they smell victory. They understand that if they can pull this off, it's probably going to end this conflict for the foreseeable future. And as we're told anyway, according to legend, as the battle is about to ensue, there are some surviving Greeks that were at Thermopylae. These are Greeks that Leonidas dismissed and sent back south before the final assault. And they give speeches to every contingent of Greeks in different components of the battlefield, these fiery speeches in which they're telling them to remember the sacrifices. And if the sacrifices of that Spartan force are to mean anything, it has to be here and now. And this is the moment. This is when they have to take advantage of the situation. And so this rallying cry of Thermopylae, some say that the rallying cries were simply the 300, things along those lines. This is a fiery, determined, and a very dangerous Greek force, and they have, they have the bloodlust thrown into them here. They're ready to go when this battle starts, and it is an absolute. It's an absolute massacre. The Persian forces are embarrassingly defeated. In fact, the Greek losses at Plataea ostensibly numbered less than 200 casualties, of which there ostensibly were fewer than 100 dead on the battlefield, as in sharp contrast to the Persian force, which loses thousands and thousands. And the remnants of that Persian force, they limp away and they retreat onto their remaining ships, and they sail east back to the Persian Empire. And they do not, there is never again a Persian incursion from that's a really fun rhyming term, right? Persian incursion. There's never another Persian invasion from the east to the west entering into the Greek city-states again. There will be battles between Greeks and Persians, as we well know when we talk about the Macedonian, Macedonian-led Greeks that deal with Darius III in the 4th century BC. But never again does the Persian Empire move westward into Greek territory and try to seize actual Greek city-states. So this is a significant turning point. Okay. Now, here's what I need to kind of set the stage for. So we've got the Battle of Plataea in 479, August of 479 BC. Critical point. This is, for most historians, when they think about the classical Greek period, the period that we got to move through here is going to not only be a compare and contrast, in a sense, between the Athenian sense of being Greek and the Spartan sense of what it means to be a Greek, although we will certainly be dealing with that. Oops, kind of got off center there, sorry. That's part of what we're doing, but it's also just to try to highlight the elements of classical Greek civilization that have made a dramatic impact on something broader, which is to say the development of the West and modern Western civilization. So many of the Greek traits of this classical period served as blueprints for our own civilization, and for the Romans, who are obviously going to be studying a little bit later in the semester. Okay, so establishment first and foremost. So on your outlines, we've moved from the Persian Wars. Now we're digging into the classical Greek period. On Monday, I'm going to walk you guys through some critical elements of Greek philosophy. We're specifically going to deal with Bill and Ted's favorite philosopher, Socrates, Socrates, and Plato. I'm not going to hit Aristotle on Monday because Aristotle comes a little bit later. Aristotle is Alexander the Great's tutor, in fact, and that is not until the mid 4th century, so a little bit later in time. Nonetheless, that's where we're moving on Monday, deal with a worldview evaluation of these two great Greek giants, these two giant philosophers. So we're going to get to spend some time there on Monday. But I do want to set the stage here by just digging into a little bit of the critical realities of classical Greece, obviously centered in the Aegean. And let's start with a comparison between two different leagues. So we have something that I talked about the other day. Oh, by the way, something I didn't mention the other day, I want you to be aware of a term. So obviously with the Greeks in the Athenian mold, we're talking about Greeks who are experimenting with democracy. Granted, it's a representational democracy. We're not dealing with pure democracy. Especially with large city-states like Athens, there's no way you can make that work. So the model for democracy is somewhat limited. Smaller Greek city-states, it is true, if they were small enough, they actually did experiment with pure democracy, where every citizen literally met in these open forums and would talk about issues and vote. That does work if you have a small enough polis, but many of the Greek, poleis are quite large by comparison to those smaller ones, and so they just could not make that form of pure democracy run smoothly. So we're dealing with democracy if we're talking about Athens, but we're not dealing with that if we're talking about Sparta, obviously, nor with many of Sparta's allies, who are, I think, at some level fearful of democracy. And in Sparta, a term you need to be aware of is that we're dealing with oligarchy. So I don't think I'd brought that term up, and I realized after the fact that I hadn't. So I talked about the dual monarchy with Sparta, the two kings that check each other's power. And we've already talked about the ephors and the other councils. But it's important to note that Sparta is rightly defined as an oligarchy, which essentially means rule by a powerful few, right? So in Sparta, that means the aristocratic class. And we know that aristocratic class, the homoioi, are the equals, right? The 10,000 equals in Spartan society. They're the ones that make all the decisions. And even in the homoioi, we know that there are, elite groups that are allowed power over the others. So we have council of 28 members, right? That of elderly members that are making a lot of decisions, and we have the ephors in particular, the five and ephors. So very different societies, and we'll see here. One of the things that I think comes to the forefront is as respected as Spartans were, as much as other Greeks looked at Spartans and they said, those guys are unbelievably great warriors, and the virtues of courage, especially as seen in the warrior tradition, those traits are off the charts and very impressive. So that remained for the Spartans for some time, but for good reason. A lot of Greeks began to look at the system of oligarchy and the ways that Spartans live. So that Spartan definition that we talked about, the Spartan society, the fact that the Spartan state oversees every aspect of life from cradle to grave. These things many Greeks were not as excited about. And one of the reasons that Athens in this classical era gains a lot of momentum is because many other Greeks were attracted to what the Athenians and those in and around Attica were experimenting with. So I want you to be aware of this. And we also remember we have the two leagues. So the Peloponnesian League, this is the league run by Sparta. It pays Sparta tribute for being in the league and for setting up defense networks, etc. So the Peloponnesian League, and over north and east, we have something called the Delian League, which is a forerunner really to the expansive Athenian Empire that comes during and after the Peloponnesian War. So the Delian League is an important thing for you to note. The idea here is very, very similar to the Peloponnesian League, and that is that these allied members pledge to defend one another in time of conflict. They pledge to combine resources, including military resources, if and when that becomes necessary during a time of conflict. There is a rather extensive treasury that is brought together that Athens oversees. So Athens is in charge of both the construction and maintenance of this treasury and for the defense of it. And the reason that the league is named as it is because the treasury exists on the island of Delos. If you look on the map, it's south and east of the Attican Peninsula there. So southeast of Syros, you see the Delos, right? Okay. So Delos is where the treasury is housed. for the Delian League. So all the members of the league are making monetary contributions to the league broadly, but of course to Athens as it oversees everything that's going on. First thing that the Delian League does is it oversees the guarantee that the Persians have not just limped away and then decided to regroup, but that indeed they are chased from the Aegean. So they're chased from, so remnants of the Persian force, some of them ended up in Thrace for a time. They're banished from Thrace. Some of the Persians began to make their way back into places like Xanthus, on up here, Ephesus, no, Magnesia, and a couple other places in Asia Minor. And the Delian League essentially steps in and they decide to make sure those sectors are cleared. There's also a big problem in the era after the Persian War. So in the 470s, there's an issue in the Aegean with some pirates, and the Delian League, they formulate a pretty dramatic force to go and hunt down these pirating groups and to bring them to justice. Most of them are just killed, in fact, but some of the leaders are brought to Athens and they are imprisoned. There's a crucial leader that I want to mention in passing. I can't spend too much time on him. His name is Cimon. It's spelled Cimon in Greek and actually in Latin, Roman Latin. The C is often a hard C rather than a soft sounding one. So it's Cimon is his name. And he comes to power for a time. He's important during the developmental stages of the Delian League. And he's important for a number of reasons. I think for me, when I think about his approach to these issues, he faces a bit of a quandary, maybe an opportunity. There are those in the Delian League who are not as excited about the democratic principles, and they pressure Cimon to kind of move back to some more traditional forms, some elements of traditional Greek monarchy, kind of some more autocratic, structures, similar in a sense to, of course, what we would expect to see in Sparta. And Cimon, thankfully, Cimon makes another choice. He essentially takes what Cleisthenes had put together, all the democratic principles that are brought to the forefront by Cleisthenes, and he decides to keep the constitution that Cleisthenes puts together, and in fact to even expand on those principles and make them even more inspirational. Cimon gained a fair amount of popularity for his military successes against the Persians, and also there are many who respect him because he's one of the few leaders in Athens in particular who seems to be able to relate to the Spartans pretty well, pretty favorably. It's not as if the Athenians and the Spartans are ever going to be best friends. That is very unlikely. They do not understand one another in many ways, and their societies are very different, even though they're Greek. But there is a level of respect and diplomacy that exists with Cimon, and he actually gets a lot accomplished as far as solidifying some bonds of friendship with Sparta, and even having some trade agreements with Sparta, which is very rare. The Spartans do not typically agree to those. So Cimon is a guy who's capable of getting things done. Unfortunately for Cimon, he gets on the wrong side of some Greek aristocrats, some Athenian aristocrats. He's banished for a time. He does return briefly, but then he dies, and there is not there are different versions for Cimon's death. Some say the conspiracy theorists love to talk about murder. It's very possible, however, that he simply died of disease or even old age. There are a lot of different recollections of this. So here's what I want to move into and talk about, and that is Pericles. So Pericles is the guy who replaces Cimon. And this guy is someone that you're definitely going to have to know a fair amount about. Cimon would maybe be an idea on an exam. I might have you write something on him, but he's less important than Pericles in a number of different ways. So Pericles becomes the leading statesman of Athens. And you see this is for much of the 5th century. He oversees this era of classical Athenian culture, the likes of which the Greeks never saw before, and in many respects they do not see after his death and after the Peloponnesian Wars are over. This is Athenian democracy at its greatest extent. This is Athenian cultural enterprise at its most obvious levels, its most impressive levels. So this is the freest government yet to that point in Greek history. I'm going to put the slide here that shows the Acropolis in Athens in frame here, because I think we just need to think about what's going on. So remember that the Acropolis is the religious and civic center of the polis, and here it's certainly that is true with Athens. The Acropolis of Athens in particular is the result of Pericles and his leadership. This is the freest society that the Greeks had experienced to this point, with the greatest number of Greeks, regardless of their families' wealth, regardless of their origins, the greatest number of Greeks having access to greater wealth, greater privilege, greater say in the civic decisions of the polis. Under Pericles' leadership, there was the decision to lessen some of the restrictions that had been in place for participation. So things like restrictions on archonship, for instance. I'm not going to go into all the different decisions, but archons or archons, as they're rightly referred to, had typically been restricted to the aristocracy, and now those restrictions were lifted. Citizenship. So citizenship in Athens for a time had been achieved through elite status, essentially. Primarily, these are the Athenian aristocrats. So it meant that your parents and grandparents, the lineage had to be secure, and these had to be Greeks that were highly respected and typically very wealthy. Okay, well, those transitions had begun under Cleisthenes, they're continued under Cimon, and they're completed in a sense under Pericles. And one of the things that he does is he says, you know what, let's pull out some stops here and try to broaden the enterprise a little bit. And there's a law that is passed through the assemblies which says that citizenship in Athens will from that point be limited to those men with 2 Greek parents. And you hear the language and it's like, well, it's limited though. But the difference is that any Greek man whose parents were also Greeks, they're considered citizens of Athens. Now, we'll get to some of the gender inequality here in a minute, but I do want you to understand that to this point, the restrictions had been much broader, and these had favored Greeks from the aristocratic backgrounds primarily. And so now it's basically saying, look, if you're a Greek, your parents are Greek, you're good. You're an Athenian citizen, full-fledged. Also, popular assemblies. There had been a number of different assemblies, as we saw the other day, the way these were structured. The assembly system was still to a very real degree favored the aristocracy and the magistrates and things along those lines. The popular assemblies had for a time been limited in their capacity to produce meaningful pieces of legislation and turn things into laws for Athens as a polis. But there is this move under Pericles to make popular assemblies capable of approving all decisions. So whatever decisions are made, they have to pass through the popular assembly in Athens. And that popular assembly, by definition, is made up of Athenian citizens, which of course are all men, but now those Athenian citizens are not just aristocrats. So the popular assembly that is approving the provisions that are sent to it, these assemblies, these popular assemblies, are now including far greater percentages and far greater components of Athenian society. There's no standing, militarily, the Athenians, and this is no surprise, other than an officer corps that remains in training for both the Greek army and the Athenian army and the Athenian navy, other than some specific training, some professionalized training for what essentially is an officer corps. A very small grouping, by the way. We're not dealing with hundreds and thousands of Athenians. We're dealing with a couple hundred maximum. So other than that, there's no standing army, right? There's no professional standing army in Athens. The idea that would have been offensive to the average Athenian would have felt like some sort of a military dictatorship of sorts. So that's not in play. Probably less of a good idea here is that the Athenians decided that they didn't require a standing police force. That was problematic at times. Pericles just believed that giving Athenians the freedom to practice virtue was an automatic good. And to his credit and to the Athenians' credit, this society functions remarkably well and pretty smoothly, but you and I both know that human beings are human beings, and there are going to be those who take advantage of that capacity to loot and steal and do the things that people do when they're criminals. So that's something that is in play here. I did want to talk about gender equality issues for a second. So I want to talk about the women of Athens under the leadership during the era of Pericles. Now, it is true that women in Athens and these democratically oriented Greek city-states, it is true that they were excluded from most aspects of public lives. They were not citizens of Athens, for instance. We know this. And in the private sphere, at least on paper, at least in a legal sense, at least in a cultural sense, their lives were largely controlled by the men. So by their fathers or their husbands or their older brothers or whoever it might have been. So like we see in Sparta to a degree, it is true that even in Athens, you would have seen that women, their responsibility to their polis, even in a democratic and more open and free democratic polis like Athens, the responsibility of women was to produce male heirs for the household. And they were raised to be a part of that process. There's sometimes some contrasts between legal or cultural norms, right, and the realities of life. And there are a number of Greek women in the classical era here who stand out and become very famous. Some of them we're going to learn about. We have some students who are doing some presentations. So Aspasia will come to mind, right? So Aspasia, who's the companion of Pericles throughout his adult life. I'm not going to steal anyone's thunder here, but Aspasia is a great example of this part of that is probably because of her association with Pericles. I grant you that, but there are women like Aspasia who don't allow themselves essentially to be confined by cultural expectations, and they are much more assertive, and they have a commanding presence, and they gained a great deal of respect from the men in their own personal lives as well as the men in the polis more broadly. And they were even in a number of cases, including Aspasia's, when they were invited in to speak to popular assemblies and convince the crowds there by their own volition, convince the crowds of their particular ideas. And that never ever would have happened in a Spartan polis, so a Spartan oriented polis. So there are some differences. We are certainly dealing with a patriarchal, male dominated society, even in the Athenian, the more democratically oriented poleis. But I would also say that compared to the Romans, in many respects, the Greeks were far more equitable when it came to the women of their culture, which isn't saying much perhaps by modern standards, but it's an important thing to note. So, okay, I want to talk a little bit about slaves, slavery in Greek life. I've got another great picture here, a great slide of Athens, right? The city-state of Athens here and how it was constructed. So, and I'll get to some of the structures here in a minute. Chattel slavery, which we all know to be skin color-based slavery, and the idea of chattel slavery is that you literally own that person outright. So chattel slavery was rare at first, but it began to increase after the Persian Wars. Most of the slaves in Greece, as we already know, Greeks did not typically enslave fellow Greeks, unless, of course, we're talking about the doggone Spartans who enslaved the Messenians and created them, or made a slave status for them, right? So the Helots are Messenian Greeks. Other Greeks typically were not enslaving Greeks, so they would enslave, Egyptians and Phoenicians, and they would enslave Persians, certainly, probably with pleasure, but they were not enslaving one another. Most of the slaves in the Greek islands worked on farms. They did a lot of as you would expect, the most difficult, demanding physical labor jobs. So, some of the farming could be pretty rough, especially in the hot summer months. Working in the mines, the various mines, that would have been some of the worst labor possible, actually. So these are where the slaves are being brought and they're put into service. Like we will see with Roman society, however, the Greeks seem to have this, this, again, you guys need to understand, this is not an excuse for slavery. We all know slavery, owning other human beings, is an abomination. We get this. Cultures since, the Sumerians, so 5,000 years up till now, cultures around the world have dabbled in, and sometimes even dabbled extensively, based societies on slavery. We know this. But it's interesting to me that both the Greeks and the Romans had a strong commitment to liberation of slaves. In fact, it was very common in both Greek culture and Roman culture, whereby a slave in service to their master, who was consistently, doing their duties and consistently loyal, whereby just through that level of consistency, they could be freed, earn their freedom. There were also a lot of protocols in place whereby a slave who was able to commit an act of unbelievably benevolent service. So some exceptional event occurs, and the slave is part of this. So maybe there's a battle, and a slave is there on the battlefield serving their master and protects them from assault and death. It was not uncommon for the Greek master to free the slave, for instance, things along those lines. couple of interesting events. So I'm not going to go into the detail on this one right now. It's interesting, an example of mass freedom. Those happen a number of different times in Greek history. I think the one that comes to mind most specifically is in 406 BC at the tail end of the Peloponnesian War, the Great Peloponnesian War. More out of desperation than anything else, I suppose. The Athenians released all slaves of military age and granted them citizenship. Of course, if they were willing to fight in the war for them at that point. And that's in part because the Athenians and their allies had suffered such great losses that they were desperate for manpower. So, but it's an example that there were mass, mass movements where slaves were in fact released from their enslavement. So this is a reality of the Greek world that you need to be aware of. Okay, I want to talk a little bit about just some of the basic structures of Athenian culture and classical Greece here. We're going to dig into some philosophy and a little bit about the dramatists on Monday. So I'm going to talk a little bit about art and culture and philosophy on Monday, and we'll get there with that. When we talk about the classical Greek period, it's important to note how critical the basic structures of ancient Greece were. So architecturally speaking, we're talking about some monumental shifts in the understanding of architecture and how to build increasingly unbelievable, majestic pieces, majestic buildings, and to make them not only work, but also to look beautiful. And something I've got to make sure I can find the link. I'm going to try to post a link about Art of the Western World, presented by a guy named Michael Wood, that walks you through a little bit of this. I'm going to do that next week because we're going to be moving through from the classical Greek period into the Peloponnesian Wars, and it will help to have some other connections. So I'm going to give you guys some links in the next 5-6 days or so, and allow you to dip into this a little bit and see how important it was for the Greeks to experiment with these architectural principles, things that the Romans were eventually going to borrow from quite heavily. Let's see here. So the Athenian Golden Age. Yeah, we're gonna dig into this a little bit more on Monday, but this screenshot I think is helpful for us because it gives us an idea. This is Athens, and the lower left slide is an artist's recreation based on archaeologists and anthropologists and what they have constructed. It's a vision of what the Athenian Acropolis would have looked like at the height of the Golden Age. And I think it bears mentioning. So even in the upper left corner, you see Athena, right? So Athena, the goddess, right? And in the temple, the Parthenon itself, which is in that slide, it's the upper right building, right on top of the stony outcropping there. So the Parthenon is a civic project that is commissioned by Pericles during the 5th century and ultimately completed. And the statue of Athena was housed inside, and originally, the statue which was very typical of the Greeks. They would have made sure that there was color supplied to the statue, and the eyes, the eyes were glowing with precious stones, and it was a huge statue that towered over everything and reached almost to the top of the roof inside. So the reverence for Athena and the connection to ostensibly her service to the Athenian people, protecting them from foreign invaders and all the rest. We know, of course, that about the Greek philosophers. We're going to be talking about two of the three greatest Greek philosophers of all on Monday. And as I said, the Greek dramatists, all of this, all of the things that we associate with classical Greece, those are all happening during this era, during the time of Pericles. And what a time it would have been to have been alive and to witness and to see this culture as it was flourishing and expanding and existing in ways that the Greeks had probably never imagined even 40 or 50 years before. So the Athenian Golden Age is a critical point for us to examine. Okay, guys, gals, for today, I'm gonna cut us off there. On Monday, I'm definitely hoping that we're gonna be back together and in the classroom. So, obviously, if we're doing that, then I'll see you then, and we'll move forward. If we're not, if for some reason the smoke issue is still really bad or whatever problem may crop up here and there, I don't know, I can't predict, but if something like that continues and we're still limited to remote learning, then I'll obviously inform you of that, and we'll go about our business. But until then, I think you're set. Make sure that you watch, not just for this class, make sure you're engaging with the various remote options that my colleagues are doing. I need you guys to know that this was primarily done, the recordings were done because I've got a fair number of students who are dealing with displacement from the fires, either personally or their families are, and they're helping, and it's a pretty chaotic moment. So I thought that these lecture recordings were just going to be more convenient for students to let them get to these things when they have the time. All right, guys, I think that's it for today. So have a good rest of your evening, and I will be in touch over the next couple days. All right, see you soon.